Okay, we are on to chapter 44, which is called Almost Here. And today's reading will be a little bit shorter because chapter 46, which is coming up shortly, is a pretty lengthy chapter and a pretty exciting chapter. So it'll be a good point to end on for tomorrow. So this is just like the setup for chapter 46, these next two. Peter flew high over the wall along the back of the Astor property and settled gently on the ground. He walked to the wall's iron gate and found the latch, and as Wendy had promised, the gate could be opened from the inside without a key. He carefully lifted the latch and pushed the gate open so Wendy could come through. They left the gate ajar. Peter pointed towards the bushes where the bobby was concealed, and Wendy nodded. They split up. Peter was going towards the bobby, and Wendy was melting into the shadows along the wall in the other direction. In the pocket of Wendy's skirt, and not happy about it, was Tinker Bell. Peter didn't want her with him for fear her glow would give him away. He walked on tiptoe until he could just make out by the faint light from the service entrance the profile of the bobby who was facing the house. Peter crept toward him, closer and closer until he was barely 2 yards away. He took a deep breath, then in one quick motion, lunged toward the bobby, grabbed his hat, swerved away, and started running. "Hey!" shouted the bobby. "Come back here! Stop!" Peter glanced back to make sure the bobby was chasing him. He was, in fact, quite close, and Peter picked up his speed, sprinting through the gate. The bobby was right behind, still shouting, "Stop!" And this is what prevented him from hearing the click of the gate closing and it locking behind him. It was darker on the other side of the wall, dark enough that Peter could cheat a bit. He was more flying than running now, and his feet were barely touching the ground. Increasing his lead, but remaining close enough to be seen, he led the bobby to the same clump of trees where he and Wendy had stood a few minutes earlier. He stopped, making sure the bobby could see him, then put the hat on his head, grabbed the trunk of a large oak, and shot up the tree, moving his arms and legs to make it appear like he was climbing. In seconds, he was high up in the tree, hidden by the darkness and the mass of branches. The bobby puffed up to the base of the tree. "You there! Come down right now and give me my hat!" "I don't think I will," called Peter. "I really like your hat." Enraged, the bobby grabbed the tree trunk and tried to hoist himself up, only to fall to the ground in quite an embarrassing manner. He jumped to his feet and ran around the tree looking for a way up, but finding none, there were no branches low enough for him to reach. Still, he ran around the tree several times like a dog chasing an invisible squirrel. Peter found this part quite amusing. "Parker!" a voice called from the dark. "Over here!" shouted the bobby under Peter's tree, and a second bobby came trotting up. Peter recognized him as the one who'd been guarding the front of the house. "What happened? I heard someone shouting." Some wretched boy stole my hat," said the first bobby. "How'd he do that?" "He ran up and snatched it. Now he's up in this tree." "He climbed this tree?" "Yeah, and I'm going to go up there and strangle him with my bare hands. Do you hear me, boy? With me bare hands." How are you going to climb that tree?" The second bobby. "I can do it if you did it. Give me a hand." And in there lies the joke, because Peter didn't climb the tree, and Peter was smart enough to choose a tree that would be really, really challenging to climb, thus giving Wendy some time with what she needs to do. Reluctantly, the second bobby clasped his fingers together so the first bobby could use his hand as a foothold. The first bobby again grabbed the tree, putting his weight on the second bobby's hands, and lunged upward. This time they both fell ingloriously to the ground. Peter laughed out loud. This made the second bobby as angry as the first, and the two of them struggled to their feet, resuming their furious but fruitless effort to climb the tree and strangle the boy. They were so focused on the task that neither one of them noticed the dark shape that darted out of the top of the tree and swooped back toward the house. A tiny light shot toward him, and in a second, Tinker Bell was at his ear. "Her dress smells like seaweed," she said. "Did she get into the house?" "They let her in. She left the back door open." "Good," said Peter. "I think those two are going to be trying to get up that tree for a while, but we'll keep an eye on the neighborhood in case anybody else shows up." "You want me to make you dinner, too?" "That'd be nice," said Peter. Tinkerbell made an impolite sound and zoomed off. Peter landed by the service door and went into the house. He ran through the staff kitchen and up the stairs where he found a scene of emotional turmoil. Mrs. Bumbrake was sobbing with joy and relief when embracing the long-lost Wendy from the front, while Michael and John were hugging her from behind. Close by, looking unhappy but not quite joining in the hug, was Uncle Neville. Peter hesitated in the doorway, unnoticed, reluctant to disturb the emotional reunion. "Wendy," said Mrs. Bumbrake, "where have you been? We've all been so worried." "I know, I'm sorry," said Wendy, extricating herself from the hug. I promise I'll explain." She turned to Uncle Neville. "Uncle Neville, I'm so sorry I took your ornithopter. I just had to." "Nonsense," said Uncle Neville. "You did brilliantly. How did you get it to fly so well?" "Well, how far did it go? A mile? 2? Wendy smiled. "It went a lot farther than that." "Really? You must tell me how—" He was interrupted by Mrs. Bumbrake, who had just spotted Peter. "Peter, is that you?" "Hello, Mrs. said Peter as he was smothered in Mrs. Bumbrake's embrace. "Who is Peter?" asked Uncle Neville. "He's a family friend." "I see." Clearly not seeing. "We have to go right now," said Peter. "What?" "Peter's right. There's no time to explain, but we have to leave immediately." "Go where?" Peter and Wendy looked at each other. "We don't know, but we—" "What is that?" said John into the blur of light, zipping across the room and stopping on Peter's shoulder. "That's Tinkerbell." "My word," said Uncle Neville, gaping. "It's a fairy," said Michael. Tinkerbell made an unhappy sound. "She prefers the term bird woman," said Peter. Tinkerbell chimed rapidly in his ear. He nodded, frowning. "How far?" Tinkerbell chimed some more. "Keep an eye on them," said Peter to Tink, and she zoomed off. "What is it?" said Wendy. "Police," said Peter. "A lot of them, at the bottom of the big street out front, headed this way." "That's it. We have to leave right now." But if it's the police, wouldn't we want to—" "I'll explain later," said Wendy, "but right now you must trust me. Everyone in this house is in great danger. We have to get out now before those men arrive. Please, Uncle Neville." Neville blinked once, then said, "Okay." "Thank you," said Wendy. "We'll leave by the service entrance. Michael, John, come along." She took her brothers by the hand and started for the stairs, and Neville was right behind, but Peter looked at Mrs. Bumbrake, who had not moved. "Come on, Mrs. Bumbrake," he said. "Can't," she said. "Mrs. Bumbrake, please, the men will be here soon." "I don't care, miss. I'm not leaving Lord Astor." Wendy stopped, and her face turned white. "Oh, dear, I'd forgotten." "Can he walk?" said Peter. "No, he's much too weak." Peter and Wendy exchanged a look. "What do we do now?" Tinkerbell zoomed back into the room, chiming urgently. "What did she say?" said Wendy. "The men are almost here," said Peter. And that's the end of the chapter. And so the authors really do a good job writing that, because they kind of lead you to forget that Leonard is in the house. They put all the attention on the other characters until the very last second, when they remind you that Leonard's there, leaving you with that feeling of, well, what do we do? And then, of course, they end the scene so that you're left to think about, if you were Peter and Wendy and you have someone in your house that can't move and you have people moving in, what is your plan? So they're going to leave you thinking about it for a chapter, and then we'll get back to that exciting scene in chapter 46. But for right now, chapter 45 is called A Whisper Down the Tunnel, and we are with Molly down in her chamber. Molly was growing desperate. For 2 days, when she thought it was safe to do so, she tapped on her rock against the bar of the cell, sending hello in code and sometimes SOS. But she got no answer. There was definitely someone in the cell farther down the tunnel. The guard delivered food there, but for whoever it was, they never responded. Molly concluded that the other prisoner either didn't understand Morse code or simply didn't care to respond to her messages. She decided to risk calling out. Keeping her voice to a whisper, she cupped her hand to her mouth and called out, "Psst! Hello?" Nothing. She raised her voice. "Hello? Can you hear me?" Still nothing. Molly slumped to the cell floor and put her face in her hands, sobbing. She had resigned herself to the fact that she was with her family again, that she was going to die in this cold, miserable place. All she had left to hope for was a stolen moment of communication with another human being. And now even that hope was gone. Then she heard a voice, a forced whisper from down the tunnel. "Molly? Is that you?" Molly sprang to her feet. She pressed her face against the bars. Could it be? "George!" she called out much too loudly. "Here now," said a guard. "Shut your mouth or I'll come down there and shut it for you." Molly didn't dare say any more. She could barely speak anyway. She clung to the bars with both hands to keep from falling into sobs as they were racking her body, an outpouring of crying that was pent up over so many lonely days and nights. Several long minutes passed. Then a whisper came again. "Molly, is that really you? Are you all right?" It was several seconds before Molly had regained control enough to answer. Finally, she whispered, "It's me. I'm alive." George groaned. "Oh, Molly, please forgive me. I should have believed you. Are the children okay?" After a moment, George whispered, "They're fine." His hesitation troubled Molly. And you can think about why George is probably hesitating there, because he's not really sure. He's been gone for so long as to, are the children truly okay or not? "George, do you know Morse code?" Of course, I learned it from a friend of my father's. A chap named Robert Baden-Powell served in Her Majesty's Cavalry. "George, I've been tapping to you in Morse code for days." "Oh, I thought it was the pipes." "No, it was—" "I said shut your gobs. You're getting no food today, and if I hear another word from either of you, you're going to get me boot in your face." The guard stomped off, but this time not far. He was clearly waiting and listening, and George and Molly remained silent in their cells. For as hungry as she was, Molly didn't care about the food. She survived a day without eating. She felt hope stirring again after so many nights of despair. She was no longer alone. George was nearby, and even though they couldn't talk, they could communicate. They would find a way to get out of this horrible and get back to their children. They had to. Molly picked up the rock again and began tapping to George. And that's the end of the chapter. And so, finally, a little bit of hope for Molly after what's been a pretty rough book for her so far. So the next chapter that we will read tomorrow is one of those classic Peter chapters that is very, very lengthy. It switches scenes a lot from inside to outside, and it's one of the better chapters in the book. And Leonard will be featured in it as well. So we'll see you tomorrow for tomorrow's Read Aloud.